Now we're going to move into a new section of the conference. The section title is America's Original Sin Against the National Covenant, Slavery. And our first speaker is Dr. Glenn Loury from Brown University. Dr. Loury is an economist. Now, he's published mostly in the areas of microeconomic theory, game theory, industrial organization, natural resource economics, and the economics of race and inequality. And the title of his talk, at least at one point the title of his talk, was Exile and Return. So please welcome Dr. Loury.
Thanks, Jerry. That was the title you chose for my talk. So. I only have 18 minutes, so I'm going to get started. It's good to be here. Good afternoon, everyone. This talk addresses the philosophical limits of the concept of racial justice. I argue that this notion should be replaced with an ideal of transracial humanism. Not all moral dilemmas are justice dilemmas. Not all inequalities are evidence of unfairness. Not every group disparity requires political remedy. Neither can every historical wrong be rectified, nor can all political conflicts be reconciled. I will argue that the ongoing and seemingly permanent subordination of so many descendants of the African slaves within today's American social economy shows the truth of these claims. I will suggest that this circumstance is mainly a relationship problem, not a justice problem. Its solution lies primarily in redefining identities, not redistributing resources. The biblical story of national covenant, exile, and return provides helpful analogs for the new relationships and identities that are needed. Please bear in mind that I am a social scientist, not a theologian, and so will be speaking in that voice here. I will begin by making two fundamental observations about social capital and race. Some 40 years ago, in my doctoral dissertation at MIT, I had the good fortune to coin the term social capital. By discussing here, briefly, how I came to coin the term social capital, I can further illuminate the contrast that I want to draw between informal social relations and formal economic transactions as mechanisms perpetuating the subordinate position of Black people in the United States. I set out in that dissertation to contrast social capital with what economists call human capital. Human capital theory imports into the study of human inequality an intellectual framework that had been well developed in economics to explain the investment decisions of firms, a framework that focuses on the analysis of formal economic transactions. Put simply, my point in 1976 was that associating business with human investments is merely an analogy, not an identity, particularly if one seeks to explain persistent racial disparities. I argued that important things were overlooked in the human capital framework, things having to do with informal social relations. There were two central aspects of this incompleteness which I wish to call to your attention right now. First, I stress that all human development is socially situated and mediated. That is, I argued that the development of human beings occurs inside of social institutions. It takes place as between people, by way of human interactions. The family, the community, the school, the peer group, these and other cultural institutions of human association are where human development occurs. As a consequence, many resources essential to human development, the attention that a parent gives to her child, for instance, are not alienable. Developmental resources, for the most part, are not commodities. Development is not up for sale. Instead, structured connections between individuals create the context within which human development resources come to be allocated to individual persons. Opportunity travels along the synapses of these social networks. The development of human beings is not the same as corporate investment. Consequently, it may not be a good metaphor or a good analogy to reason as if this were so. People are not machines. Their productivities, that is, their behavioral and cognitive capacities bearing on their social and economic functioning, are not merely the result of a mechanical infusion of material resources. Rather, these capacities are the byproducts of social processes mediated by networks of human affiliation and connectivity. This was fundamentally important, I thought, and still think, for understanding persistent racial disparities. That was the first point that I wanted to make about the incompleteness of human capital theory. My second observation is that what we are calling race is mainly a social and only indirectly a biological phenomenon. The persistence across generations of racial differentiation between large groups of people in an open society where individuals live in close proximity one to another provides irrefutable indirect evidence of a profound separation between the racially defined networks of social affiliation within that society. Put directly, there would be no races in the steady state of any dynamic social system unless, on a daily basis and in regard to their most intimate affairs, people paid assiduous attention to the boundaries separating themselves from racially distinct others. That is, over time, race would cease to exist unless people chose to act in a manner so as biologically to reproduce the variety of phenotypic expression that constitutes the substance of racial distinction. I cannot overemphasize this point. Race is not something given in nature. Rather, it is socially produced. It is an equilibrium outcome. It is something that we are making. It is endogenous. Thus, if the goal is to understand durable racial inequality, we will need to attend in some detail to the processes that cause race to persist as a fact of life in the society under study. For such processes almost certainly will not be unrelated to the allocation of human developmental resources in that society. Here then is my second observation in a nutshell. The creation and reproduction of race as a feature of society rests upon a set of cultural conceptions about identity held by the people, blacks and whites alike, in that society. These are the beliefs the people hold about who they are, about the legitimacy of conducting intimate relations with racially distinct others, and here I do not only mean sexual relations. My impulse to contrast human and social capital all those years ago was rooted in my conviction that beliefs of this kind affect the access people enjoy to those informal resources that individuals require to develop their human potential. What I called social capital in 1976 was, on this view, a critical prerequisite for creating what economists refer to as human capital. This point is crucial, I think, if we are to understand the persistence of racial inequality in America today. So that was Glenn Loury circa 1976. By 1985, I had become a Reagan Republican. I was given in those years, me and Bob Woodson. I was given in those years to emphasizing the problem of single-parent families, to talking about births out of wedlock among blacks, about low labor force participation and poor educational performance, about high criminal participation and victimization rates, and so forth. My favorite formulation was, there's an enemy without, namely racism, but there's also an enemy within, namely behavior patterns inhibiting African Americans from seizing such opportunities as had come to exist. I argued that these opportunities, though not completely equal, were much more equal than had been the case before the Civil Rights Movement. I stressed to other blacks every chance I got that if we were ever to achieve true equality within American society, we could not simply rely on anti-discrimination laws and affirmative action. We would also have to address some of these internal patterns. Today, more than 3 decades later, I still believe this to be the case. I thought then and think now that it is implausible in the extreme to expect that such patterns, as the majority of children born to African American women being born to a woman without a husband, would be reversed by government policies such as the redistribution of resources. If they were to be reversed at all, I reckoned, this would require a determined effort by African Americans ourselves to think differently about our responsibilities to our children, to our ancestors, and to one another. We needed to grasp the nettle to face up to our existential circumstance, to be honest about the problematic aspects of our culture, and to take responsibility by addressing them. No one is coming to save us, I would cry out. Amen. This is not a question of justice, I would say, for certainly it isn't fair that we, the descendants of slaves, should find ourselves in this circumstance. Nevertheless, it is necessary to take on these responsibilities in view of the fact that nobody is coming. And more fundamentally, given that no one can come into our intimate gender relations, for example, into the families and neighborhoods where our children are being raised or are not being raised, for example, so as to reorder those cultural institutions amongst African Americans in such a manner as would be more developmentally constructive. These matters are ultimately and necessarily in the hands of African Americans, I reckoned. What we are talking about here is facing up to such questions as these. Who are we as a people? How then must we live with one another? What will we do to honor the sacrifices our ancestors made to leave us the opportunities we now enjoy? What do we owe to our children? We are talking here, in other words, about the African American communal covenant. But that's not the only thing we're talking about. We're also talking about the reality of racial stigma. Without appreciating that some bodily marks signify things in American society, negative things, otherness things, that influence the chance for people bearing those marks to develop their full human capacities. Without seeing this, one may attribute the backwardness of some of these people who have been stigmatized to their essence. One will say, in effect, it must be something wrong with those people. Nothing wrong with us that causes them to be so backward. One will eschew social and political and moral responsibility for their plight. One will conclude that their failure to develop their human potential either reflects the absence of such potential in the first place, and we have books on the shelf making that argument, or one will decide upon this narrative. Their failure is due to their backward culture, which sadly but inevitably, what more can we do, causes them to lag behind. Yet they are not the authors of the stigma that engenders developmental bias against them. When we understand that the way people come to value things or make decisions is partly created via interactions in society, then their flourishing or lack thereof reflects on that society as a whole, as well as on themselves. It reflects on us, Americans, as well as on them, African Americans. These symbols signifying racial difference are freighted with important connotations that can have an adverse effect on a person's opportunities to develop his skills. Specifically in the US context, blackness has meanings associated with it that are stigmatizing. This stigma inclines people to a presumption against the merits of the person bearing the mark. Although, as was noted in the service today, the stigmata of Jesus, empowered by God, can overcome all of this. And I believe that. Stigma inclines people to a presumption against the merits of the person bearing the mark. People start to doubt the assumption that the stigmatized one is like us. It leads an observer to be reticent about entering into intimacy with such a person. The result is a social allocation of developmental resources that leads to development bias. I'm taking the view here that people don't make social judgments based on straightforward benefit cost calculations. And I'm saying that even though I'm an economist. Rather, they often act on identity considerations. They ask such questions as, who am I? How then ought I to live? With whom should I associate? And when ought I to extend to this other a benefit of the doubt? Racial inequality is, in substantial part, the outcome of a system of non-market social interactions, such as these, that entangle us all together in a seamless web. And that leads me to an important conclusion, namely, how a society answers the question, who are we, is very significant. It's certainly an important question here in the United States today. Who are we? Whose country is this? When we talk about crime and violence and school failure and urban decay, are these matters in the back of our mind that we understand as us against them? Because if it's us against them, anything becomes possible. It becomes possible to say about those people languishing in the ghettos of our great cities, that's not my country, that's some third world thing. This, in fact, was actually said in 2005 during the flood of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, but it's a lie. Black people in New Orleans have been there for 250 years. They're not aliens. They're as American as you can get, as American as anybody can be. That was us down there crawling on the rooftops. That was us huddled without dignity in the Superdome. That was us. I maintain that these problems are a quintessentially American affair, not simply a measure of the inadequacy of Black culture. They reflect upon our social inadequacy, I wish to argue. And I buttress that argument by observing the incompleteness of human capital theory, by insisting that human developmental processes are socially contextualized, and by stressing the foundational role that race plays in all of this. This is what I mean when, being an economist, I nevertheless insist upon placing relations before transactions. I am talking here, in other words, about the American nation's civic covenant. Let me conclude. Consider the poor central city dwellers who make up perhaps a quarter of the African American population. The dysfunctional behavior of many in this population is a big part of the problem. Conservatives, therefore, when they demand greater personal responsibility in these quarters, are acting in both a necessary and proper way, I would hold. And yet, confronted with the despair, violence, and self-destructive folly of so many people, it seems to me morally superficial in the extreme to argue, as some conservatives have done, that those people, they just need to get their act together. If they did, like so many of the poor immigrants, we wouldn't have such a horrific problem in our cities. To the contrary, any morally astute response to the social pathology of American history's losers would have to conclude that while we cannot change our ignoble past, we need not and must not be indifferent to the contemporary consequences of it. Their culture may be implicated in their difficulties, but then so too is our culture complicit in their troubles. We bear collective responsibility for the form and texture of our social relations. Thus, while we can't ignore the behavior problems of this so-called underclass, we should discuss and react to them as if we were talking about our own children, neighbors, and friends, which is to say, this is an American tragedy. It is a national, not merely a communal disgrace. Changing the definition of the American we is a first step toward rectifying the relational discrimination that afflicts our society. And this will require adjusting ways of thinking on both sides, or better, all sides of the racial divide. Achieving a well-ordered society where all members are embraced as being among us should be the goal. This, I claim, is the principal implication for racial reconciliation of America's national covenant. Thank you.